He will either die in office or be removed in something that will almost certainly then become violent, or be removed in violence.
Do you know what I think Churchill would have made of 2014? It would have been his Rhineland moment or his Anschluss moment or his Munich moment. It wouldn't have been the moment in which he, got NATO to go to war over this. He wouldn't have done that, but it would have been the key moment that he would have rallied opinion against Russia and to have recognised that they were on the road to war.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. So, as we enter the third year in the war in Ukraine, we're drawing from the past and looking at what one of history's great wartime leaders, Sir Winston Churchill, often compared with President Zelensky, would do to defeat Vladimir Putin.
Here, in this island fortress, that he will have to reckon and settle in the end.
I will be leaving the Parliament today, thanking all of you in advance for powerful English planes.
Well, joining us is Professor Lord Andrew Roberts, a member of the House of Lords and one of Britain's best-known military historians, who first started writing about Churchill more than 30 years ago. His latest book is called Conflict, the Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. And Professor Michael Clarke, a professor of defence studies who's a leading analyst on the conflict, and his newest publication, Great British Commanders, is out later this year. Welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Many comparisons, as I said, have been made between President Zelensky and Winston Churchill as wartime leaders. Professor Lord Roberts, you have been studying Winston Churchill, as I said, for more than 3 decades. How far do those similarities go?
I think they go relatively far, in fact, yes. I think that, of course, Zelensky has been described by Jonathan Friedland in the Guardian as Churchill with an iPhone. And I think there's something to that. The way that he stayed in Kyiv at the beginning of the war was reminiscent of Churchill in the Blitz. The way that he uses his rhetoric and oratory and his real connection with social media and his capacity to get the message out is something that I think that Churchill would have been profoundly impressed with. His relationship, and I'm sure Michael will be very interesting on this, with his generals. Actually, it strikes me, he makes it very clear that he is in charge, and that's something that Winston Churchill did, at least in the Second World War, not in the First World War. So that was much more complicated. But he has the two men do have similarities when you take into account, of course, the fact that there's 70 years between them.
And what do you think, Michael Clarke, in terms of the relationship between President Zelensky and his generals compared to that of Churchill?
Yeah, I mean, as Lord Andrew said, the war thrusts the national leader into the spotlight, and Churchill with an iPhone, I think, is exactly right. And a lot of people say to me, what was the key moment in the first part of the war? And I say the key moment lasted less than 40 seconds, when on the second night of the invasion, Zelensky was out on the streets with his Ministry of Defence and 2 or 3 other members of his cabinet. It's a very dangerous thing to do, because there were 6 assassination squads running around Kiev trying to get to him, to kill him. And 2 of them have been neutralized by them, but not the other 4, as we understand it. And he went out on the street and he said, I'm here. I'm not running anywhere. I'm here. The minister's here. We're all here. And it was a short little clip that he did, but he showed there the profound understanding of an actor, a comedian, somebody who knew the media, who had a very good media empire before the crisis began, and a communications team second to none, actually. His own comms team, who are still there now, are the best in the business. And so he instinctively understood that you turn up on the street, you show that you're there, you don't need to do it for very long, you don't need many ringing phrases, just the sheer sincerity of it convinced people. And that fundamentally changed. It changed the war. It showed the Ukrainians that they were going to fight, and it showed the Americans that the Ukrainians would fight. And so the whole thing turned from a Russian coup d'etat, a military-backed coup d'etat, into a full-fledged war, which is where we are with it now.
And Andrew Roberts, one of the things that you talked about before was the way that Churchill was one of the first people to warn against German ambitions in the First World War. He was one of the few prominent people to warn against Adolf Hitler and the rise of the Nazis. He was against appeasement. Why did he see what others didn't?
And actually, you can add, of course, that he was the first major Western politician to warn against Stalin and the imperialism in Eastern Europe as well after the Second World War. So he got three of the really big issues of the 20th century right. And he had this extra view that an awful lot of other politicians of the 30s didn't have, which was that he was a Philo-Semite. He liked Jews, he got on very well with them, and therefore he had a sort of early warning system that a lot of the other politicians of the 30s, frankly, quite a lot of them who were anti-Semitic, didn't have. He also had a great sense of the arc of history. He'd seen what had happened, not personally, of course, but he was an historian himself, and so he knew what had happened with the Spanish Armada and with Nelson and with the Napoleon's time and of course his own great ancestor at the time of the War of Spanish Succession, the Duke of Marlborough, was key to winning that war as well. And he'd fought in the First World War. So for that, this was not the first time Britain had been under direct threat. And he was able to put the threat of Hitler into that kind of continuum of British history.
Most important things about just to build on that because of that sense of history, he had a sense of the strategic focus. In the Second World War, he was absolutely focused on what the problem was. And you say, he warned about Stalin, but remember, he said when Germany attacked Russia, he said, I'd have a good word for the devil if he'd joined the coalition against Hitler. It was absolute strategic clarity. The one and most important thing we must do is defeat the German threat, the Nazi threat to Britain. That clarity and that sense of national mobilization. You can't think of many politicians who had that. He certainly didn't get that in the First World War at the beginning. He didn't really get it even halfway through with Lloyd George. He was close, but you don't get it quite in the same way.
No, but you do get it with, not at all. You do get it with Zelensky, though, don't you? He understands that this is total war. This is something that you've got to have no male of military age, is going to leave Ukraine. They are going to put the entire economy into a war footing. This is something he grasped the concept of total war the minute that he wasn't great actually at grasping the idea that it was definitely going to happen before it happened, but as soon as it did, wow. And that phrase, of course, about how we need ammunition, not a ride, was another of those moments. Like you said, the 40 seconds, that was another of those moments which absolutely framed the conflict for the world. Do you know what sorry, could I butt in here again? Do you know what I think Churchill would have made of 2014? It would have been his Rhineland moment or his Anschluss moment or his Munich moment. It wouldn't have been the moment in which he, got NATO to go to war over this. He wouldn't have done that, but it would have been the key moment that he would have rallied opinion against Russia and to have recognized that they were on the road to war in the way that Rhineland and Anschluss and Munich did.
Mike, what lessons do you think Churchill might have drawn upon to get Ukraine out of the current situation on the ground where the battle lines are largely static?
Well, he was a great man for national mobilization. He understood the need to mobilize in this sort of struggle. And of course, he was sparking with ideas all the time. Some of these ideas were hopeless, but he loved technology. He loved new ideas. He ran with things. And people like Dudley Pound, the first Sea Lord during the Second World War, he would sort of take some of these crazy Churchill ideas and kind of shepherd them out of play. Dudley Pound always said, you never say no to Churchill. But he also said that, if you make it clear, if you have a point to make, he will let you make your point. So never say no to him, but you sometimes have to shepherd his enthusiasms out of the way. On the other hand, a lot of his enthusiasm turned out to be just right. So he was a very contradictory character. He was like a firework going off in all directions. But he needed people around him like Alan Brooke and Dudley Pound as well, and Cunningham after that in the naval sphere, who could sort of shape all these ideas into something a bit more strategically applicable. And you could see Zelensky is a bit like that. I mean, he's got lots of things he wants to talk about. He talks about 1 million drones by the end of the year. He's grabbing at everything he can use to fight the war against the Russians, and he needs people around him as well who can help him help that sort of restless intensity which he embodies to apply it in a way that needs to be applied. Churchill would never have been, I mean, Andrew would have this one, but I mean, Churchill would never have been as effective in the war were it not for Alan Brooke beside him as his great...
Oh, certainly. Alan Brooke said that Churchill came up with 100 ideas a day, of which 3 were good. And so the key what Alan Brooke...
That's a big attrition rate.
Well, exactly. So what you need is an Alan Brooke who is going to be able to get rid of the other 97, essentially. Can I go back to something that Michael said earlier, which I so agree with about El Alamein? What you've got to remember, of course, about El Alamein is that war, which was the first British victory on land. We'd won the British Battle of Britain, of course, in the air, and there had been some victories on the North African littoral against the Italians by then. But as far as taking on the Germans was concerned, Alamein was the first victory on land, and that comes 3 years and 2 months into the war. It is not. It's a long time. It's another year plus from the amount of time that Zelensky's been fighting. So one's got to. I think sometimes we are too expectant, especially with that the big autumn counteroffensive at the end of last year. We're building up too much expectation sometimes for what the Ukrainians are capable of doing.
Mike, you say 2024 is like 1942, a tipping point. What parallels do you see?
Yeah, exactly that. That somehow Ukrainians have got to be kept going this year. I mean, my understanding is that Zelensky is quite upbeat. A lot of people around him are not, but my current understanding is that he's upbeat about maybe a summer offensive, which doesn't sound entirely credible to me from Ukraine's point of view. But I think the Ukrainians will certainly try to pull some surprises. They'll try to make the most of what they can do and see if they can score some good public relations hits in the way that, let's say, the Dam Busters raid was a great public relations hit. Didn't make a whole lot of difference to German industry, and the attack in 1943 wasn't followed up by bombing the repair to the dams, which would have made the winter of 1943-44 very difficult for the Germans. We just didn't do it. It was a one-off hit, which was a fabulous raid, made very little difference, but it made a huge difference to the image of Britain, particularly in the United States and so on. And I can imagine that Zelensky will have those sorts of things in mind, as will Syrskyi, his commander-in-chief now. But the underlying strategic reality is the Ukrainians have got to survive this year and hope that the Western world gears up more than it has done so far to actually give them the wherewithal to conduct an offensive in the spring of 2025, which incidentally is when the Russians will be capable of a strategic offensive as well. So we'll be in that position of who goes first and with what effect.
I think it's worth remembering, of course, that Churchill was the godfather of the tank, and
Yes.
and Zelensky needs tanks. He needs those Abrams from the Americans, more of them. He needs tanks from everyone. The Leopard from Germany, obviously, as well. I think Michael's absolutely right about the need for a spectacular. I think the place might be Crimea, because that is such an important aspect of the Russian sense of who they are and what they're trying to do and how they are moving forward. So think of something naval in and around the Crimea, in my view.
I am thinking of something naval, actually, Andrew Roberts, and it's actually one of those 97 bad ideas that Sir Winston Churchill had every day, perhaps for more than one day, the Gallipoli campaign of the First World War, this attempt to break the stalemate on the Western and Eastern fronts by taking control of the Ottoman Straits to ultimately topple the Ottoman Empire. We all know it failed, and spectacularly. It was his most famous military failure as First Lord of the Admiralty. What do you think he took away from that and he learned from that built him into the wartime leader he was in the Second World War?
Oh well, he listened to the generals, as Michael was saying. He listened to people like Alan Brooke and his naval commander Pound and Charles Portal at the Air Ministry. He never once overruled the chiefs of staff when all three of the chiefs of staff of the Second World War came to a agreement. And there are times when he nearly did, in March 1944 over Sumatra, for example, but he never actually did. And that is because he remembered he was a politician who learned from his mistakes. He made lots of mistakes all the way through his career. He made mistakes, but he learned from all of them. That's not always true of politicians today, but it was true of Churchill. And that was the mistake that he learned from.
And as a result of Gallipoli, he went back into the trenches when he stepped down from government, and he did something which was politically very clever, even though I'm sure emotionally he wanted to do it. He went and fought in the trenches, or wore a French helmet so people would, and a strange greatcoat so everybody would know who he was. But he actually smartened everything up in the trenches in the command that he had. He was only there for a few months, but he made a difference. And for a cabinet member, First Lord of the Admiralty, to go and fight in the trenches alongside the boys, that was a big political move. Very brave.
He was 40 years old. We were not calling up 40-year-olds at that stage in the war. He was married. He did not need to do it. But as a redemptive act, essentially, he did do it. And he took part in no fewer than 30 trench raids. He got as close as to the German trenches. He could hear the Germans speaking in their trenches. This is something that I don't see British cabinet ministers doing when they screw up a campaign. Frankly, do you?
Yeah, and he also took part in the last cavalry attack in the Battle of Omdurman in 1898. Yeah. He was part of the very last cavalry attack ever undertaken by British cavalry, and he was there.
So, Mike, as we enter this third year of the war, what mistakes do you think President Zelensky has made, and what evidence do you see of him learning from them?
I think his mistakes are that he's talked up Ukrainian prospects probably too far from the autumn of 2022, because he kept having to come to Western capitals. He was feted for 12 months in every capital he came to, and he kept having to say, look, we'll do this, and he sort of said we'll finish the war by the end of 2023. He was talking up prospects. And I understand why he did that, but now the effect of that is that he's lost some credibility among Western publics, and people still sympathise with him, but they don't see him now as such a good predictor of what is likely to happen. And I think there's been some internal issues. I mean, they say that him and Zelensky didn't speak very much. Him and Klitschko, who's the mayor of Kiev, whose office is only just down the street, they don't speak. And the fact that the president's office seems to be cut off from other offices, the common factor is that Zelensky has become a bit isolated. And I think that is a dangerous thing. And what he seems to be trying to do now is move towards a more of a government of national unity. Remember, his mandate runs out in May this year. The fact, they postponed elections, and the 2019 election gave him a mandate which expires in May of 2024. And so after May, he's going to start to look a bit less credible, particularly to governments in the global south, who are constantly being criticized for not having elections. And a lot of those autocratic governments will say, oh, look at Zelensky. He should have stepped down by now, and he's still in power. Isn't that interesting? He's got to do something about that.
Equally, we suspended elections during a war. That it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do if you've got a full scale war, and they've got a war actually on their land. 18% or so of Ukraine is Russian occupied, so they have more of an excuse really for putting back their elections than we had in the Second World War as well. I think another problem. Sorry, we're talking about issues. A major problem, of course, the sort of elephant in the room with Zelensky is his relationship with Trump.
That was my next question.
Was it? Yeah. I mean, it is so terrible. There's probably nothing he could have done about it, because Trump is a hugely mercurial figure, obviously. But nonetheless, the way in which the Republican Party in America seem to have fallen for this narrative, and much of it which is a conspiracy theory, actually, about how about how Zelensky is corrupt and so on, is going to be extremely dangerous if, of course, Trump wins the election.
How do you think, Andrew, that Churchill would have dealt with Donald Trump?
He'd have sucked up to him like crazy from the minute that he knew that he had a bad reputation with him. Churchill did go over to the United States as much as he possibly could in the Second World War. He didn't just concentrate on being nice to the Democrats, to FDR's Democrats, but he also reached out to former isolationists in the Senate, Republican isolationists, and worked incredibly hard on that side. Now, we know, not least from what Marjorie Taylor Greene said about David Cameron only last week, kiss my arse was her quotable phrase about when David was trying to get the Congress to pass this $60 billion deal. And I'm afraid, that's the sort of default position of everybody except for the sort of country club Bushite Republicans who have a much more, in my view, responsible attitude towards this.
Mike, former military leaders like the former head of the British Army, Lord Dannatt, they've drawn comparisons to this moment with the 1930s. Do you see it that way, that we're in this kind of pre-war phase right now, as the Defence Secretary's already said as well?
Yeah, I mean, nothing is inevitable, and we're certainly not predicting that there's got to be a major European war. But undoubtedly, we are on a road that can lead there, because we took the view until 2022 that Putin was the playground bully, but he was a rather calculating playground bully, and that he'd be a nuisance. He'd just be a nuisance for the foreseeable future. But there was no reason to regard that as strategically important unless we mishandled it in some way. But then with the invasion of Ukraine, everything has changed, because Putin has no choice now but to double down. I mean, he burns every bridge he crosses, and so he has to keep going. And what's happened is that his intrinsic sense of Russian imperialism has now become the dominating force. He held it in his mind before, but now he has to go down that road. And so he is a threat to European security, a manifest threat for the future. And we either address it now, or we address it in 3 years' time, or 5 years' time, or 8 years' time. And each time we leave it, it will be harder to address. So in that respect, yes, it is like the 1930s. Whether we'll end up in the same place, of course, we don't know. But it would be better to address it sooner rather than later, because of what we now know happened in the 1930s. This is what happens when a dictator is on a track that they cannot get off, even if they wanted to, and he doesn't want to.
I think it's worth adding to that, with which I completely agree, that back in the summer of 2022, when he wrote that 6,500 word historical essay called On the Historical Unity of the Ukrainians and Russians, which essentially argued that Ukraine didn't have a right to exist, he mentioned Lithuania no fewer than 17 times in that article. And that's something we ought to really think about, because Lithuania is a NATO member. If he crosses the border into Lithuania, we will be going to war with a nuclear dictatorship.
We mentioned earlier, Andrew, that Churchill was among those who recognised Adolf Hitler's ambitions in the interwar period. How far do you think the comparisons between Adolf Hitler and President Putin go?
Well, one always really wants to go out of one's way not to equate Hitler with anybody in the modern world, frankly, because it's always a bit of a bear trap historically. But if there is anybody, then of course you're looking for a totalitarian dictator who invades his neighbours, has absolutely no time for human rights, murders his domestic opponents, and the tragic death of Alexei Navalny can essentially, I think, be put down to his choice of Putin's choice of where he was going to be imprisoned and so on. So yeah, of course, the Venn diagram has lots of overlap areas, but equally, it's and David Cameron himself has at the United Nations equated Russian aggression with the Nazis. So I think it is a fair one. But of course, nobody's exactly like Hitler. I'm not for a moment suggesting that Vladimir Putin wants to gas 6 million Ukrainians, for example.
What are the chances, Michael Clarke, of Putin having the same kind of, well, not exactly the same, but a violent end as did Hitler?
Oh, well, nobody expects President Putin to retire peacefully to his dacha or his palace in Sochi and live out the rest of his life observing Russian politics as they pass in front of him. That won't happen. And so he will either die in office or be removed in something that will almost certainly then become violent, or be removed in violence. I mean, nobody can foresee a peaceful transition, and there never is not in most Russian history or in Soviet history. And all Soviet leaders have been removed in some fairly forcible way, followed by a period of interregnum, where 3 or 4 people seem to vie for power, and then one of them emerges until they are removed, and so on. I mean, Khrushchev was the closest to somebody who was removed and lived more peacefully for a while, and Gorbachev was another one. But always there's the transition from one regime to another is never smooth. It's always difficult, and it's always full of unpredictable elements. And that's why we say that Putin will not be replaced by a nice man. All we're sure of is it will be a man. But what we're playing for in the longer term is maybe to get on terms with the next but one after Putin. And that might not be so long after Putin, maybe 3 or 4 years, but we are still talking about the 2030s here, not the next 22 or 3 years, I think.
And you can actually go back, of course, as well into the Tsars. Lots of them were overthrown in palace coups, sometimes by their own sons, and those also wound up as a very bloody thing. I mean, we would all love to see, wouldn't we, President Putin one day standing up in front of the International Criminal Court, but frankly, that's not the way of Russia.
And Andrew, at what point do we start looking towards the future and thinking of the kind of Russia and Russian Federation that will come out of this and its relationship with the rest of the world? Could it be divided, broken up as Germany was? I mean, how do you see the future?
No, I don't think. I think it'll be up to the Russians. I think if we try to involve ourselves in internal Russian politics, that way madness lies. That's the point at which any Russian would be able, perfectly reasonably, to fly the flag of ultranationalism and say, "Look, this is the West interfering in our affairs." So the poor old Georgians and Azerbaijanis and you name it, they are going to have to work out their own future relationships with Russia. The best that we can do is to protect the Baltic states and give Ukraine as much as we possibly can to allow them to win this war.
And how does the way the war ends, Michael Clarke, do you think, affect the futures of the Caucasus, other Russian satellite states like Kaliningrad, Belarus, for example?
Well, it's an intrinsic case. I mean, it's really important. If this war ends badly for Ukraine, then all of those territories that you mentioned and Europe as a whole will be far less secure. The rest of the world will have made its mind up that therefore the West is a paper tiger, that the West offers guarantees and makes statements, but they don't really mean it. They can't back it up. Everyone will draw their own conclusions from that if Putin is seen somehow to triumph in this. However, if he's seen to fail, and we can argue about what does success look like for Ukraine, but if the political judgment is made that the Russians are pushed back to where they were by February 2022. So this imperialist adventure of Putin has failed. He'll have paid an enormous price for that failure. That would look pretty much like victory to me. And the expectations, therefore, of the Lithuanians, the Baltic states, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and the client states in Africa and the Sahel, they would all change their view. And that's why, as we've said before, what this Ukraine war is very important, of course, to Ukraine. But now we've staked the reputation of the Western world on it, or the Western liberal democracies, to mean what they say about the rules-based international order and the unacceptability of naked aggression. So it matters in a much broader sense.
Which is why I agree with all of that. But you have to think about how we're going to put our money where our mouths are. And the answer has got to be, it strikes me, that the $300 billion that is presently being held in Euroclear of Russian assets held in Brussels in Euroclear should be taken and sequestered and given to the Ukrainians for their defense and reconstruction. It will, especially in the aftermath of the death of Alexei Navalny, it will tell Putin that there are consequences to his evil actions. And of course, it would obviate the problem that we're going to have with if there's such a thing as another President Trump, who if you give 300 billion to the Ukrainians, they might be able to see through the 4 years of getting nothing from a President Trump who vetoes every aid package.
Michael Clarke, how do you react to those who advocate a negotiated peace which cedes territory to Russia in return for NATO membership, certainly totally rejected by President Zelensky right now, and a large number of the people in Ukraine itself? How do you see that thought?
Well, it goes back to the old idea that it's very hard to negotiate with somebody who's trying to kill you. And what President Putin seems to be offering is that, well, we'll do it in installments. So we took one installment in 2014. We'll take another installment in 2022 to 24. We don't honour any agreements we make. Putin has not got a record of sticking to any agreements that he makes. So they'll come back in 2026 or 2027 for the rest, or for something more. There's no future in a negotiated settlement. There might be some future for a temporary ceasefire sometime on more favourable terms to Ukraine, but that's Kiev's judgment. It can't be our judgment. I don't think any negotiated settlement from where we are now could possibly be stable for even the next 3 or 4 years, let alone the next 10 or 20.
Andrew Roberts, World War II, as we know, lasted from 1939 to 1945. Are we looking at a similar time frame for Ukraine?
Yes. Yes, I'm afraid we are. I think that, and that's on the assumption that the West does continue to support Ukraine and to give it what it needs. I mean, this bill, the $60 billion bill, has to go through Congress. It's absolutely essential that it does, and that's obviously under a Biden administration. The timeframes, wars tend to take longer than you think that they're going to. The largest number of people die in the last quarter of the war. That's the time when the real bloodletting takes place. Historically, this is there's been an analysis of something like 350 wars since medieval times, and a few things do emerge that tend to be quite universal, and that's one of them. That the bloodletting actually happens towards the end. And we've had large amounts of bloodletting already, so God knows what it's going to be like at the end of this one.
It's the same in the dynamic of battle as well. That, historically, most casualties in a battle occur towards the end of it, because one side cracks or the front breaks up, and suddenly it becomes chaotic, and one side is victorious, and it's in that chaos of victory and defeat at the final third or quarter of a battle, whether it's a month-long battle or a day-long battle. That's where most people get killed and injured.
Andrew, do you think Russia can still be defeated?
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely, I do. Yes. I think if you give the Ukrainians long-range missiles, if you do what I mentioned earlier, unfreeze the Russian assets and give the Ukrainians the money, they obviously the Russians are willing to take huge numbers of casualties, but there is a point where armies' morale breaks. We saw in Kharkiv in the autumn of 2022 a breakdown in Russian morale where they retreated over hundreds of kilometers very suddenly. Oh yes, it's not by any means certain that Russia's going to win, and if it does win, it's going to be in a long and grinding process that can be, I think, reversed.
Michael Clarke, by President Zelensky's admission, the format for ending the war will be decided this year. So, what are the options?
Well, the options are for this year that both sides carry on until one can exert a strategic benefit against the other, and this war will not be either won or lost by any one side. I mean, one side will prevail for the time being, and if that side is Ukraine, then it buys them sort of 30 or 40 years of armed defense. I mean, they'll have to be a very heavily defended country for the foreseeable future. If Russia prevails, I don't think they will prevail this year, but if they prevail, say, sometime in the spring or summer of next year, then the problem still goes on, because the war will turn from being a war of liberation, Ukrainians trying to liberate their territory, to a war of resistance, resisting this Gestapo style of Russian behavior in the occupied territories, and that will be pretty gruesome in its own way. So for the Ukrainians, they will not lose this war. They'll just turn it into a different sort of war that will be open-ended. And what we're looking at realistically is some sort of ceasefire where the West Europeans can somehow insert themselves, perhaps with NATO membership, to solidify that ceasefire into a Cold War between Ukraine and Russia that will then last for the next couple of generations.
Yeah, it could be like North Korea, South Korea, a sort of a DMZ zone that keeps both sides on their toes for, as you say, a couple of generations. But there are other slight aspects of hope for Ukraine. The Ukrainian economy, for example, they now export pretty much all of their grain because they've managed to push the Russian fleet out of the western side of the Crimean Seas. So that's a very positive aspect too. You're getting a sense that yes, their entire generation of young men are going to the front, but they've got a very low, it's growing, but still low rate of people refusing to serve. It is growing, but nonetheless, it's nothing like you'd expect for a nation entering its third year of war against a dictatorship like Russia.
Michael Clarke, what do you think the most important thing President Zelensky might learn from Winston Churchill's ideas on leadership as he faces what he concedes is the most difficult period so far in this war?
National mobilization. The thing that is holding Ukraine back at the moment is the speed at which he can really mobilize the whole society. Churchill was good at national mobilization and maintaining that strategic focus. And I think that's, Zelensky has those instincts, and I think he needs to, turn his talent for convincing people into that sort of effect that he can have on Ukrainian society. He's got to maintain both a sense that they can prevail, but that they must mobilize even further to do so. That's what he most needs, because that's what Churchill had in abundance. With all the things that were wrong about Churchill, all the mistakes he made, he is fundamentally somebody that British history is grateful to for that strategic vision and sense of unwavering mobilization.
And Andrew Roberts, if Churchill were alive today, what experience or events would he be drawing upon to get him through this moment?
What experience from the 1940s, from his own life, you mean?
Yes.
Yes. The Blitz. Of course, the moment in May 1940 when some of his own cabinet ministers were thinking about making peace with Hitler, and he outmaneuvered them and stopped that from happening. The moment when the United States came into the war in December 1941, and instead of concentrating on the Pacific where they'd been attacked, he managed to get them to support the Germany First policy, where 70% of American resources went to eastward to fight against the Nazis. These are major moments. Obviously, the moment that Michael mentioned earlier, where he in a second threw away a lifetime of anti-communism when Hitler invaded Russia on the 22nd of June 1941 in Operation Barbarossa, and said, if Satan invaded, I would have if Hitler invaded hell, I would have a good word to say in the House of Commons about Satan. That kind of thing is maybe the moment where Zelensky somehow is able to convince President Trump that President Trump will go down as a truly dreadful president if he allows Russia to reconstitute and pose a threat to the world.
And just finally, if I could ask each of you, how will President Zelensky go down in history?
No, well, I think Zelensky is the great hero of the first part of the 21st century. And that's the point. I mean, Putin will go down as the great international criminal of the 21st century, this first part of it. And Zelensky will go down as the hero of it. And one of the reasons that Putin hated him so much is that when he was a comedian, before he took on a political role and ran for president, he used to do sketches where he impersonated Putin, doing quite obscene things. And one of the reasons they hated him is that he was this rather rude comedian who laughed at Putin all the time. And so here he is now. I mean, who would have thought that transformation from being a vulgar comedian to the hero of the 21st century, which he undoubtedly is?
I think we should also remember, of course, that Winston Churchill lost the election at the end of the Second World War. So even if Zelensky does get muscled out politically, and his popularity is still at 62%. Yes, it's not the 85% it was the year before last, but nonetheless, it's still at 62%. So he could win the next election, but even if he doesn't, that doesn't mean that he hasn't got the Churchillian position in history when it comes to this war. Is the war, Ukrainians' foundational war of independence. It's their 1776. It's their great moment. The Israeli equivalent would be 1948. Lots of countries have these foundational wars. This is Ukraine's, and he was in charge, and no one can ever take that away from him.
Professor Andrew Roberts, Lord Roberts, and Professor Michael Clarke, thank you so much for your time. It's been fascinating talking to you and having your thoughts today. You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Kate Chabot. If you'd like to support us, you can subscribe now or listen to Times Radio or go to thetimes.co.uk. My thanks to our producer today, Morgan Burdick, and to you for watching. Bye-bye.